Good morning. We begin the book of 2 Samuel today, and combining yesterday and today's readings is chapters 1 through 5. 2 Samuel is mostly about King David's rule. The early chapters, most of 1 through 5, deal with David has become king of Judah after Saul's death, and Saul's sons are kind of kings over Israel, and there's some warring and a lot of fighting going on for a while, and then David makes a covenant with them. But there's at the end of the book we'll move into Solomon's reign, I believe, and but it starts out with like after the death of Saul. David had returned, and David found out about Saul's death. A man came that had been at the battle, an Amalekite, he said he was. And David asked him, what happened? How do you know for sure? And this man says, well, I was at the battle, and I was walking around, and I came across Saul had fallen on his spear, and there was no hope for him, and his son Jonathan was there, and Saul asked that I would kill him, and I did. And then David had this man put to death because he had killed the Lord's anointed. And it seems kind of backwards in so many ways, because Saul had asked his armor bearer to kill him so that he wouldn't be taken captive. And Saul had fallen upon his own spear, but yet David didn't think it was right for this man to have done that. And so then David sings this a song of lament about Saul and Jonathan. And it says in verse 18 that he ordered that the song of the bow be taught to the people of Judah, as is written in the book of Jashar, whichever. And that's also referred to in Joshua chapter 10. But little really is known about that writing. It's assumed that it was probably a book of poems, of songs of sort, but nothing really sure of that. So David sings and laments the death of Saul. And then, in chapter 2, David inquires of the Lord. And I think that is so important, that David inquires of the Lord. And, we'll see that many times as we read about David, that he requires of the Lord. And he says, shall I go up against the cities of Judah? And he says, get up. And he says, where shall I go? To Hebron. So then David goes to Hebron, and he makes his his capital, more or less, of the people. And David finds out who had buried Saul and sends his thanks to them. But then when we get to verse 8 of chapter 2, Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken it, and so here we find this Abner becoming one of the leaders of the Israelites. David, we're going to find out David was a king of Judah for a little over 7 years before he became king over all of Israel by the end of chapter 5, where we'll end up today. And then he reigned for a total of 40 years. But the first 7 years and 3 months or so, he was king only of Judah. It was a divided kingdom. And so like verse 8, Abner had come up and it says, verse 10, Ishbaal, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 2 years, but the house of Judah followed David. And that time David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah for 7 years, 6 months. So we're being told that here. And then it goes on to about Abner, and the son of Ner, the servants, and he went out and there was kind of a battle that came about at this pool, and they took 12 men from one side and 12 men from the other side, and the battle goes on, and there was much killing going on, and then there was pursuit by the people of David's were more successful than the others, and when it all comes down to the end of it, David's side lost like 19 men, and the other side was 360 of Abner's men died. And so again, it's kind of showing that God is favoring David. I mean, and it's just that, David is God's anointed, and those that are standing against David are in many ways standing against God. And so chapter 3 starts with, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. And David grew stronger and stronger, and Saul's house became weaker and weaker. And then we find out some of David's sons by different wives. So we come on, and then we get back to verse 6 again, after a little bit of that lineage, that Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. And we hear more about Abner. And then when we get to verse 20, Abner comes with 20 men to David at Hebron. And David had a feast for them, a banquet. They talked together. And Abner says, "Let me go and rally all Israel to my Lord and King, in order that they make a covenant with you, and that you may reign over all that your heart desires." So Abner had come to make a peace treaty with David, and get so that all of Israel was now united under David as king. And when some of David's men come back and find out that David had sent Abner off with this peace treaty, they go and take Abner and kill him and all of his men. And David, didn't order that. That wasn't what David wanted. I mean, he was ready to have signed this peace treatment. And when we come to verse 31, David said to Joab and all the people who were with him, "Tear your clothes, put on sackcloth, mourn, show your remorse, and mourn over Abner." And they buried, Abner at Hebron. And David then, sings a song, or there's a couple verses, here, laments for Abner. "Should he die as a fool cake? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered," and the people wept then over Abner. And a part of the mourning process evidently was that David fasted. And it tells us in verse 35, the people came to try to persuade David to eat something. And he said, "No, I will not eat, because that will show dishonor," more or less. And then he said that if he did that, he would ask that God would bring this same terrible fate to him. So the people realized that David was mourning the death of Abner, and that David was following what God had said, and they saw that in God, in David that way. And chapter 4, it says, Saul's son Ishmael heard that Abner had died. His courage failed, it says, and they were the sons. And then it talks about Saul's son Jonathan. I mean, Jonathan was killed in the battle with Saul, we know that, but it says that Jonathan had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when this news came, and his nursemaid, woman looking after him, took him to flee as she fell, and this young 5-year-old child became lame, and this child is going to show up again later on. In many different, in some ways as well. But, David is God's anointed king of the Israelite people, of all of the Jews, and yet there's all of this battle that goes on, and these soldiers come with, they've killed what they say are David's enemies, and David is filled with remorse, many different times with that, and like in verse 9 of chapter 4, David answered all these men, "As the Lord lives, and who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when the one who told me, 'See, Saul is dead,' thought he was bringing me good news, I seized him and I killed him, and this is the reward I give for such good news." I mean, David didn't consider that good news, and he says, "I will require your blood if you destroy those others," But there were some that, I mean, some of these again that had come thinking they were doing good for David, that David said, no, that's not what I wanted, and then had those men killed. And it's just, again, some more of that oofta stuff that, is just not good. In chapter 5, real quickly, the tribes of Israel come to David and say, look, we're your flesh and bone. While Saul was king, it was you that led us out of Israel. It was you that did all of this. And the Lord said, you shall be the shepherd of my people. The people knew this. And so here it tells us in verse 4 that David was 30 years old when he began to reign. And so he reigned this total of 40 years. And then there's a battle here again about, the Jebusites. They're going up against some others, and against the Philistines. Again, there's a battle. And the last part of chapter 5, David has gone up against the Philistines and has defeated them in one battle. But then again in verse 22, the Philistines again come. And David says, should I go out? He says, yes, but go out behind them. Take up the position in the rear, and I, the Lord, will take care of them. And this is what happens. And it says that verse 25, the last verse, David did as the Lord commanded, and he struck down the Philistines, And so the people are seeing and remembering that God has appointed David as a king, anointed him. And they're seeing that David is following God, and God is favoring David with success and with wisdom and all of that. So may God bless you today. For this day after Easter, we still continue to celebrate Christ is risen.